Hello, and welcome back to 0 to 1000, Chess Beginner Kickstarter series. In the last episode, we learned all of the rules of chess, which gives you the foundation to start playing chess games right away. If you missed that episode, you can check it out here with the title card above. Knowing the rules is just the starting point. In episode 1, we're going to take a first step into really learning strategy, how to actually think about your moves so you're not just pushing pieces around. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand the basic fundamentals of chess strategy. Let's get into it. The first thing we need to cover is the material values of all the pieces. These are not hard and fast rules in every situation, but these are general guidelines in order to help you decide which pieces are more valuable than others. Of course, the king is the most valuable, because if you lose your king, you lose the game. These material values are based off of the number of squares that these pieces are able to access in a single move. If I compare a bishop to a rook, we can see that the bishop is only able to see squares of the tile color that the bishop is on. So this bishop is only able to see dark squares on the board. A rook, however, is able to see both light and dark square tiles across the board, meaning that the rook is just able to see more of the board than a bishop is. And now that we know the material values of pieces and we have it memorized, we can understand how to evaluate trades. In this position, it's white to move. Let's evaluate the trade of taking the knight. If we take the knight, black can then capture our pawn. So the results of that trade is a knight for a pawn. From white's perspective, this is a winning trade considering that the knight is worth more than the pawn, as it's 3 versus 1 in terms of the points. If I compare it to this position, for example, evaluating the trade of taking the pawn and black taking back, both sides have lost a pawn, so that result is an even trade. And finally, looking at this trade of bishop takes pawn. If we take the pawn, and then black takes our bishop, the result of that trade is white loses a bishop for a pawn, meaning that this is a losing trade for white's point of view. Evaluating trades based on material is the foundation of all strategy in chess. If you practice in your games, anytime you see a trade, try to evaluate if the trade is winning, losing, or even from your perspective. Now that we understand how to evaluate trades, we need to now start to understand how to evaluate if a square is safe or not. Let's say from white's point of view, we're taking a look at the move knight to f3. Let's evaluate if this move is safe. The f3 square is not a square that any of black's pieces or pawns are able to capture. In this situation, knight to f3 is a safe move. I'm going to quickly flip up board to black's perspective. And now we're going to take a look at the move pawn to f5. Is this a safe move? Well, the f5 square is being looked at by the pawn on e4. That means that if we move our pawn to f5, white can then capture our pawn, and we have no pieces available to capture the pawn. Therefore, the pawn to f5 is not a safe move in this situation. The situation becomes more complicated when multiple pieces are looking at the square. In this case, let's take a look at if the move pawn to d4 is safe or not. Well, in this situation, black has 2 pawns looking at the square. And here's a simple cheat that you can use in your games to quickly evaluate if a square is safe or not. What we can do is we can count the number of pieces that both sides have that look at that square. So from black's point of view, they have 2 pawns that look at this square. From white's point of view, if we play the pawn to d4, we would have 1, 2, and the queen would be 3 pieces that look at the square on d4. If the number is even or greater, then that means that you at least have enough pieces to capture evenly. Of course, you still have to evaluate the material at the end of the chain, but in this situation, we know that if we play pawn to d4, they can capture, we can capture, they can capture, we can capture, and the result of that is both sides losing 2 pawns, meaning that it's an even trade. So in this situation, pawn to d4 is a safe move. Here's another example where we have to be careful with using the counting rule. Let's say I'm taking a look at the move knight to d4. Well, black has 2 pieces that look at the d4 square, and white has 2 pieces looking at d4 square as well. So that means we can have an even number of captures. However, those captures are not equal themselves. Because if I play knight to d4, they capture our knight, we capture a pawn, they capture our pawn, we capture the pawn, and the result of that is we actually have lost a knight for a pawn, which, going back to the first part of evaluating trades, we know that this is a losing trade from white's perspective. So going back, we know that counting the number of attackers and defenders only tells us if we'll have an even or winning number of captures, but it doesn't tell us if those captures are winning themselves or not. You still have to evaluate the trades themselves. For one more example, let's say as white, we're evaluating the move queen to g4. Is this a safe move or not? Well, as white, we have no pieces looking at the square once the queen moves there, and black has 1 piece looking at this square. That means that we don't have an even number of captures, and therefore, this is not a safe move. And now that we understand when squares are safe or not safe, we need to talk about the most important theme of pieces that you're going to see in your games. That is known as hanging pieces. In this position, let's say black plays the move bishop to g4, attacking our queen. Well, we have an option of capturing black's bishop, and if we capture black's bishop, black has no way of capturing our queen back. This bishop is known as a hanging piece, which means that we have the ability to capture it, and they don't have any way of recapturing back, meaning that the piece, in other words, is undefended. Before black plays the move bishop to g4, they needed to recognize that g4 was not a safe square. If they play it anyways, they leave their bishop hanging. Anytime, as a beginner, there's a hanging piece, we have to evaluate if we can just capture the hanging piece. And a lot of the times, the answer to that is yes, since it's just winning material for free. Now that we know what hanging pieces are, it ties nicely into the next concept, which is identifying threats. In this position, let's say that black plays the move bishop to b7. In every position in chess, after every move, you need to ask yourself, did my opponent's move create a threat? A threat, in other words, means if I don't respond to my opponent's move, are they able to win a winning trade or win a piece outright? In this case, black is threatening to capture the pawn on e4 with his bishop. And if I don't respond to this threat, then he wins this pawn for free. In this situation, the move bishop to b7 did create a threat to win the pawn on e4. So in this case, the answer is yes, this move created a threat. Let's say, for example, another move from our opponent might have been pawn to e5. Let's ask ourselves, did this move create a threat? If we don't respond to this move at all, they could capture our pawn, but in that position, we could recapture their pawn, which results in an even trade of one pawn each. Therefore, black's move of pawn to e5 does not create a threat, and therefore we don't have to respond to it if we don't want to. This is a very important game to play with yourself during your actual chess games. After every single move from your opponent, try and ask yourself, did that move create a threat? And try to answer very simply yes or no. In the next section, we're going to discuss how we should respond whenever we do face a threat from our opponent. Now we're going to discuss how we can respond to threats. So let's say our opponent plays the move bishop to b7, which threatens to win our pawn on e4. On screen, I've written out the 3 ways we have of responding to a threat. The first way, which is a much more advanced topic, is ignoring the threat or creating a bigger one. I'm not going to talk about this too much for now, again because it's a more advanced topic. The other 2 ways are really the 2 that you should be using more often, which are either to move out of the threat, either by blocking or running, or by defending. In this situation, let's see all of the ways we have of dealing with this threat. So the options we have of moving out of the threat are by directly moving the pawn out of the attack is one option. Another option is to block with the d pawn by playing pawn to d5, which blocks the attack. And finally, the third option we had was to defend against a threat. In this case, we can play a move like knight to c3, which defends the pawn. Because now if black takes, and we take back, this is a winning trade for white. So this is a successful way to defend against this threat. I do want you to be careful though, because we still always need to evaluate the trades. In this case, let's say black plays a move pawn to d5, which creates a threat of the pawn taking our knight. Well, an option is to defend the knight, but if we defend the knight, black can take, we can take, and this was actually a losing trade because we get a pawn and black gets a knight. So in this situation, defending is actually not a valid defense against this specific threat because we always need to evaluate the material first and foremost. And now that we know all of these basic strategies, I'm going to talk out loud my thoughts so you can understand how these strategies can apply to the first couple of moves of the game. Let's say as white, we play the move pawn to e4, knowing that e4 is a safe square on the first move. Black plays pawn to e5, and now we need to ask, does this move create a threat? The answer to that is no, it doesn't, which means that we don't need to immediately respond to it, and we can do whatever we want, basically. I'm going to choose to play the move knight to f3. This move creates a threat to take the pawn if black doesn't defend it. Let's say black defends their pawn by playing knight to c6. Now we need to check if we take the pawn, and then they take our knight, the result of that is a losing trade for white. So taking the pawn is a bad move. Knowing that it's a bad move, I'm not going to do that, and instead, I'm just going to play bishop to c4. I think this is enough of a demonstration, but you can see how there's a simple flow of thinking per every move. Did my opponent's move create a threat? Yes, then we need to think about how we want to respond to that threat. If it doesn't create a threat, then we don't have to respond to it, and we can do something else on the board. This really covers the fundamental strategy you need in order to actually learn the more advanced stuff, but this is really the foundation to all strategy in chess. Once you understand all of this, you're really on a great path in order to gain really good knowledge and really good strategy in chess long term and become a great player like you want to be. And that's it for this episode. From this episode, you went from only knowing the rules of chess to understanding the foundations of all chess strategy, and you understand the basics of how to think properly about strategy in your chess games. In your games, what you should do is practice this thinking by trying to identify threats, moving pieces to safe squares, trying to see if there's any hanging pieces for either side, and practicing the ways that you respond to threats. In the next episode, what we're going to cover is the introduction to tactics, or in other words, how to find moves that forcibly win material or advantages so you can actually start winning chess games to build on top of the strategy that you've learned in this episode. If you have any questions for me, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy this series, or if you're gaining knowledge and getting better at chess, then let me know by liking and commenting and subscribing to this video. Other than that, good luck in your future chess games. Look out for episode 2, and goodbye.